and delighted to have him with us. So please join me in welcoming Marco Garrido.
Thank you all for coming. It's really a privilege to be here. I've attended a lot of these noontime talks myself, so it's a pleasure to be the one presenting to you today. I'll be presenting a part of my dissertation research. Now, very broadly, to give you an overview, my dissertation examines the political effects of urban fragmentation in Metro Manila, Philippines. Now, by urban fragmentation, scholars usually mean the splintering of cities into elite privatized spaces, essentially enclavization. So, the creation of exclusive recreational areas, gated communities, exclusive business districts and commercial districts, that kind of thing. Now, I also include in my consideration of urban fragmentation the growth of slums, which is really a development that goes hand in hand with enclavization. Now, this growth of slums, it exceeds well-defined peripheries. So that means it's not just taking place in certain areas of the city, but it's happening all across the city in a motley pattern all around, and even within elite spaces. Today, for my talk, I'll be talking about the effect of urban fragmentation on the poor support of populism in Metro Manila. Now, I'm going to frame my research question in terms of populism, and I'll return to urban fragmentation later as part of my answer. Okay, so by populism, what do I mean? By populism, I mean a political style or strategy of mobilization by personalistic leaders employing anti-elite rhetoric. That's sort of the standard definition. But by itself, this definition, you'll note, is too broad for my purposes. It includes figures as dissimilar as, say, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and probably Sarah Palin, right? So I'll specify populism further, but placing it within developing country contexts marked by extreme social inequality and weak institutional forms of representation. Now, specifically in this context, populism constitutes a mode of political incorporation of the poor. Now, this usage of populism is consistent with most of the populism literature in places like Latin America, which, by the way, is the region where most of the populism literature comes from anyway. Okay, so in Latin America, as in the Philippines, the presence of socially subordinated but electorally significant populations has made populist appeals relatively common. Scholars have observed a perpetual tendency in these places towards populism, an ever-present populist temptation. So my question is, why do the poor respond to some populist appeals and not others? But to phrase this question in terms of my case, I ask, why did Metro Manila's urban poor respond to the populist appeals of Philippine President Joseph Estrada and not others? Maybe some of you know who Joseph Estrada is, some don't, but in any case, I'm going to give you some background. Okay, so who is Joseph Estrada? Joseph Estrada was a former movie star in the Philippines, and he made most of his movies in the 1960s and 70s. He was the mayor of San Juan, which is a city in Metro Manila, for about 19 years. He went on to become a senator, vice president, and then in 1998, he was elected president of the Philippines. But just 2.5 years into his term, he was accused of corruption and impeached. His impeachment trial was aborted, however, and in January 2001, a demonstration composed mainly of middle and upper class groups ousted Estrada from office. This demonstration was known as EDSA 2. He was succeeded by his vice president at the time, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Now, 3 months later, 3 months after EDSA 2, there was another larger demonstration, but this demonstration was composed mainly of the urban poor, and this demonstration was aimed at reinstalling Estrada into power. It culminated in a march on the presidential palace, but was ultimately repulsed by the military. This demonstration, by the way, was called EDSA 3. So in 2007, Estrada was convicted of plunder and sentenced to life imprisonment, but he was pardoned by President Arroyo. In 2010, he ran for president again, came in second, and some of you may have heard, but currently he's running for mayor of Manila. So his story in some ways is not over. Okay, now let's talk about the urban poor support of this guy, Joseph Estrada. This is Estrada. By the way, you'll see in the back of his jacket, it says Erap. Erap is his nickname, but it's also the Filipino word pare spelled backwards. Pare in Filipino means buddy, right? So that's how he's known. Estrada's election in 1998 was the first time that class, more than geography, gender, or age, determined the presidential vote in the Philippines. Surveys show that that even during Estrada's impeachment and ouster, the urban poor remained by his side. Even after Estrada's ouster, his net trust rating among the urban poor in Metro Manila remained virtually unaffected. This trust rating was higher in Metro Manila than the trust rating of the poor nationwide. It was higher even than the urban poor in other cities across the Philippines. Now, this kind of data has led scholars to conclude that the urban poor in Metro Manila constituted Joseph Estrada's strongest, his staunchest constituency. You know, I can tell you that the urban poor in Metro Manila supported Estrada, but I'd rather show you. And I have some pictures that can convey to you what the support looks like. That sign says, welcome President Estrada, or happy arrival, Joseph Estrada. This woman is clutching a letter. It appears to be a handwritten letter by Joseph Estrada, and she seems to be dancing. Here they are fighting over a poster of Estrada. This woman is crying upon hearing news that Joseph Estrada was convicted of plunder, and so she broke into tears. The headbands say "Free Estrada," "Free Erap." This slum in Manila broke into cheers once they heard that Estrada was pardoned by President Arroyo. And this is another slum in Metro Manila. These signs also say "Free Erap." Now, this woman is holding up Estrada's campaign poster in 2010. I don't know if you can see the campaign poster so well, but now Estrada's a city boy. He grew up in the city. Like I said, his political career was entirely in Metro Manila. But this poster depicts him, this is what I find interesting. This poster depicts him as a peasant, about 40 years younger, first of all, than he actually is, as a peasant riding a water buffalo in a rural area, and with his shirt buttoned down all the way down to his belly. Okay. All right. So the urban poor supported Estrada, right? But why? And I also want to underscore that this support was particularly puzzling, and I'll tell you why it's puzzling. First, the urban poor support for Estrada was puzzling because Estrada was bad for the poor, right? At least, when I say bad, he was bad at least in terms of their material interests. Estrada's poverty reduction program targeted a mere 0.0008% of the poor in the Philippines. That's 3 zeros after the decimal point. That's a percent, and that's merely a target, right? He prioritized the interests of real estate developers over the urban poor, and it's been documented that the poor's access to education, social services, and health deteriorated during Estrada's term, right? And yet they loved him, right? Now Arroyo, who again is the president who followed Estrada, she issued proclamations between 2001 and 2006 awarding land to nearly 200,000 poor families, a far higher accomplishment than Estrada's. And yet in San Roque, which is one of the slums where I did research, it's Estrada who they remember for distributing groceries on Christmas and his birthday. Now, the second reason why this support is puzzling is that this is a guy, remember, who was ousted, convicted of plunder, sentenced to life imprisonment, and yet still came in second, largely due to the support of the urban poor, in the 2010 presidential race. You know, the puzzling nature of this support and his success in the 2010 race really comes into relief if we consider another populist candidate in that presidential race, and this guy is Manny Villar. Let's talk about him for a sec. So this is Manny Villar. By the way, this thing that he's doing is a V, it's supposed to be a V for Villar. It's also a check, and if you're familiar with the Philippines at all, it's something kids do to call attention to how good looking they are. You know, they put it in front of their faces, you know, fit to be framed, that kind of thing. So he's doing it, I don't know why. So Villar overcame humble origins to become one of the wealthiest people in the Philippines. He's essentially a real estate magnate. His campaign touted his poor background and represented him as someone who truly cared about the poor and someone who essentially would save the poor. His most famous campaign ad depicted slum kids in a slum background singing songs, right? And this, you know, it's interesting to just, I'm going to quote just the lyrics of one of these songs that went through in his campaign ads. Have you swum in a sea of garbage, spent Christmas on the street? That's our question. Are you really one of us? Right, so he's really trying to deploy this populist narrative, right? He used every trick in the populist playbook. He appeared in a popular game show. This show appeared. It's a noontime show. It's popular among the poor, and he gave away free houses to contestants. He made extensive use of celebrity endorsers, and even put his frail 86-year-old mother on TV to plead his case, right? And yet, despite having outspent Estrada nearly 2-1, he won only half as many poor votes as Estrada did and finished third. This picture, by the way, is a spoof of Villar's campaign. The caption says, "Have you swum in a sea of trash recently?" It's a spoof in that ad that I mentioned. Okay, so why Estrada and not Villar, right? Why Estrada and not Arroyo? That's the question. I'm going to run through the literature quickly and then get to the data. All right. Now, the populist literature in Latin America explains populist support in terms of the draw of populist leadership. It focuses on the symbolic power of a populist discourse, a populist style, and the ability of populist leaders to deliver material improvements in the life conditions of the poor. Now, just to illustrate these points briefly, discourse. What do I mean by discourse? Argentina's Juan Perón, right? A famous populist. Some scholars ascribe his success to a discourse, a rhetoric, a way of speaking that accorded the poor moral superiority. Now, his wife, Evita Perón, they say her appeal lay in a populist style. She addressed the poor in language, to quote one scholar, that seemed to be extracted from soap operas, right? And people claim that this had an effect on the poor. And this last point here, delivering material improvements, is pretty straightforward. Now, the problem with this explanation is that it doesn't tell us much about why the poor actually respond to populism. It simply assumes that they do, given their marginality. Now, if you take the resentment of the poor for granted, that makes populist leadership the key mechanism explaining the support given to some populist leaders and not others. But I contend that populism properly concerns the relationship between leaders and supporters. To determine why a populist leader, while a populist leader is effective, we need to ask why his supporters respond to him. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the more Philippine-specific explanations for Estrada support. Now, before I do, I want to say that these case-specific explanations for the urban poor support for Estrada, they reflect the general explanation found in the literature. In other words, they focus exclusively on Estrada's leadership. One explanation is that the urban poor supported Estrada because of his patronage. That means that he responded directly to their particularistic demands. A second explanation is that the urban poor identified with Estrada's screen persona as defender of the oppressed. Remember, I told you Estrada was a movie star, right? Early in his film career, Estrada played the role of lower-class hero. So tenant farmer, jeepney driver, peasant, rebel, these kind of roles. Now, he played these roles so often and so memorably that a whole genre of movies developed around the actor, labeled by one scholar, Joseph Estrada proletarian potboilers. Scholars contend that the urban poor recognized themselves in Estrada's persona. Now, to give you a sense of this persona, I'm going to show you some of Estrada's movie posters. So that the title translates to Gun Battle at Pugadlawin, the Hawk's Lair. 1 Foot in the Grave. This is his pastoral piece. Sprinkle with dew this arid earth. He plays a peasant in this one. That's straightforward. Kill the pushers. Joseph Estrada as Tondo Boy. Tondo is a giant slum in Metro Manila. And here he plays a squatter who's also giant for some reason. Okay. All right, so, I hope these movie posters have conveyed a sense of Estrada's screen persona. Now, the third explanation is that the poor supported Estrada because of his pro-poor political persona. Now, Estrada defined political contention in terms of an elite-masses divide. This positioning was unequivocally conveyed by his campaign slogan, Erap para sa masa, which means Erap is for the poor. Now, you don't really get more direct than that in political advertising, right? More effectively, his brusque demeanor, boorish behavior, and open indulgence in a number of vices, including drinking, gambling, and womanizing. Estrada had about 7 mistresses during his 2.5-year presidency alone. So scholars say that this behavior endeared himself to the poor and alienated the middle and upper classes. Now, Later on, I'm going to assess each of these arguments in light of my data. But for now, what's important to note is that these explanations focus on who Estrada is or what he does, without establishing empirically what the urban poor actually saw in Estrada. All right, so now I'm going to turn to my argument. My argument consists of the following claims, and I'll repeat these claims as I proceed, so you don't have to memorize them right now. First, I claim that a spatial configuration marked by the virtual contiguity of slums and enclaves, what I'm calling interspersion, led to the rampant imposition of spatial boundaries on the urban poor. That's the first claim. The second claim is that this boundary imposition, it heightened the urban poor's consciousness of territorial stigma. And I'll explain the underlying terms in a moment. Now, the urban poor's heightened consciousness of territorial stigma led them to support Estrada, I argue, because of his concrete acts of sincerity. Now, let me define some of these underlying terms. Now, this argument includes the following, what I'm calling mechanisms, but they're essentially just causal elements. Interspersion, I've just said what that was. Boundary interspersion is pretty straightforward. Now, territorial stigma here, that's simply stigma based on residence or association with symbolically degraded places. So we're talking about stigma based on residence in places like ghettos, favelas, slums, banlieues, these kind of things. Now, this idea here, sincerity. Now, this term, I think, requires some explication. By sincerity, I mean, on the one hand, I'm invoking the common definition of sincerity as for being free of dissimulation. But I also have a more specific definition of sincerity in mind as a political practice negating stigma. And I'll illustrate what I mean by this in a moment, later on in the presentation. Okay. In terms of evidence, I use archival data culled mainly from government documents to make graphs and maps that support that document interspersion. And the other mechanisms, as I'll show you later, I support mainly through qualitative evidence, interviews, and ethnographic observation. Okay. Now, my dissertation as a whole is based on 225 in-depth interviews with the residents of slums and gated communities in Metro Manila, ethnic observation, and archival research. This research took place over the course of 12 months. Between September 2009 and August 2010. So I was there for the 2010 presidential race where Estrada came in second. Although in total I've spent about 3.5 years doing research in the Philippines since 2001. For this talk, I'm gonna focus mainly on my 107 interviews with slum residents. And these interviews took place over 4 sites. Before I'm gonna say a bit more about my interviews, but first I wanna get a few definitions out of the way so we don't trip up later. Okay, so by slums, just to be clear, I mean illegal or informal settlements in blighted areas. Now, I'm going to use the word villages pretty often, and by villages, I just mean gated communities. I use the word villages because that's how these gated communities are referred to locally. And finally, barangay. Barangay is the smallest administrative unit within cities, but really for this presentation, you just need to remember that it's a kind of ward or neighborhood government, right? All right. Okay, so these interviews, as I said, took place in 4 sites across the metropolis. I hope you can see that all right, but this shows you the sites. This is Metro Manila, and this shows you the sites where I did my field work. All right. Now, to obtain interviews with slum dwellers, I went through the barangays, again, a kind of neighborhood government. I went through the barangays in charge of them. The barangays referred me to their deputies within a certain slum area. And essentially, I started my field work by following up the barangay's leads within an area. Once I'd become familiar enough within an area, a familiar presence, I solicited interviews myself. I did this until I'd obtained between 25 and 30 interviews per site. Okay, now, I won't dwell on this slide, but the takeaway here is that the demographic characteristics of my informants, which is here, are largely consistent with those of the urban poor population in Metro Manila. This just bolsters my claim that my data is representative, that's all. Okay, I'm now going to proceed to the constituent parts of my argument. So again, I have 3 claims, and I'm going to talk about each of these claims sequentially, right? So first, let me talk about interspersion. Now here, I want to document the virtual contiguity, right? The proximity, side-by-sideness of slums and enclaves, or gated communities. Now, this spatial configuration, this interspersion, really took shape in the 1990s. To make a long story short, Financial liberalization led to a surge in foreign direct investments, which spurred a couple of construction booms in the mid-90s and 2000s. This building was led by the private sector, and it was characterized mainly by exclusivity. So again, we're talking about, gated communities, luxury condos, office buildings, these kind of things. Let me show you what I have in mind. So, this is the kind of stuff that's being built in Metro Manila in the 1990s. So these are condominiums. The other notable thing about this building, by the way, is that a lot of it was bundled together. So you have condos right next to giant malls, right next to business areas, and they're essentially in an enclosed space. Okay. Now, what's important about all this building is that it led to the runaway inflation of land values. This made housing in Metro Manila more expensive than anywhere else in Asia, despite the fact that it had the lowest construction costs among neighboring cities in the region. According to the World Bank, average housing prices in the metropolis appreciate by 32% annually. Now, the point here is that all this new development attracted workers to the metropolis, right? You needed people to build these kind of enclaves. It attracted these workers, but it made it impossible for them to reside within the city legally. In fact, only about a fifth of Metro Manila's slum dwellers are actually poor based on the government's poverty standard. Most of them simply can't afford the cost of housing. All right. Now, a number of indicators suggest the extent of spatial inequality in Metro Manila. All right. Open market housing, or housing whose price is determined entirely by the market, versus, as you can see here, socialized or government-subsidized housing, comprised 91% of all residential construction in Manila between 1992 and 2009. Now, as I said, land prices in Metro Manila are really, really high. So just being on the market, just being on the open market, makes such housing prohibitive for all but upper-income groups. At the same time, the number of slum dwellers in Metro Manila has grown considerably, constituting from 37 to over 50% of the metro population, with a growth rate 4 times the size of Metro Manila as a whole. The number of slum areas, now this is different from population, these are specific areas, right, has risen sharply in the last 2 decades as well, from 415 in 1980 to over 2,000 in 2008. Now, by slum areas, I mean settlements that can be as vast as tracts of land occupied by tens of thousands of squatters, and as small as vacant lots crowded by half a dozen families. They cover all kinds of spaces that the poor make habitable out of necessity. So by slum areas, we mean riverbanks, railroad tracks, the cover under bridges, the islands separating the lanes of a road. This filling in of almost every vacant space in the city. Now, the proliferation of enclaves and slums is taking place within the same extremely dense area, and this has resulted in their proximity. So here's the density graph, and as you can see, Metro Manila's density has doubled between 1980 and 2007. Right now, Metro Manila's density levels are 72 times higher than the density levels in the rest of the nation. So it's at about 18,600 persons per square kilometer. And that figure is the average for the entire metropolis. If you look at slum areas, if you take slum areas apart and you look at that, the density levels are 10 times higher than even that. I saw a figure somewhere that the average urban poor family of 6 lives in about 27 square meters, 27 meters of space, something like that. And that includes circulation areas, living area, walking around, that kind of thing. All right. So the point here is that there's this juxtaposition of enclaves and slums, and it's become so common during this period that a new word has emerged in Filipino to talk about the slum dwellers right beside the village, the slum dwellers right outside the village. This word gillagers came up, right? Now, gillagers is a combination of villagers, which is, again, the residents of gated communities, and the Filipino word gilid, which means on the edge or in the margin. So you have the villagers, who are the folks who live in the gated communities, and right outside them you have the gillagers, or the slum dwellers right outside the gated communities. Okay, so what I did, a large part of my research involved mapping all the villages and slum areas within Metro Manila. And I did this for Quezon City, which constitutes about a third of Metro Manila's land area. Here we go. Okay. Now, the red triangles represent villages, and the blue circles, slums. Now, I didn't put up these points here willy-nilly, but these points correspond to actual locations of villages and slums within Quezon City. Using mapping software, I calculated the median distance from a village to the nearest slum to be less than 275 meters. If you don't think in meters, just to give you a sense of how close that is, that's about as far as this building to the diag, right? Now, this figure is definitely an underestimate for two reasons. First, I was only able to map about 86% of all slum areas. The other points were too ambiguous to really find geographically. 86%. So I found about 880 slum areas in Quezon City. 880. I mapped about 756 of them. The second point, this 275 meters, is an underestimate, is that the mapping software only calculates the distance from one point to another and doesn't take into account the actual area of the places being indicated by a point. Right? So the point from this map here is that we're talking about slums and enclaves that's really close together. Okay. Now, my first claim is that interspersion has led to the rampant imposition of spatial boundaries on the urban poor. I'll show you what I mean by referring to 2 of my 4 cases. As I said, I did fieldwork in 4 slums. Okay. All right. So this is a slum here, and surrounded by the yellow margins. It's the Delarama slum. And it's supposed to be a part of this village here called BF Homes. This is a gated community. You can tell just by the density levels. Now, this area here, at least part of it, used to be part of this village, but it was eventually overrun by squatters, and it was never really developed. Okay. Now, here's what I want to point out in this picture. Now, as you can see, this slum here, Delarama, is bounded on one side by this village, BF Homes, and it's bounded on the other side by, this is a cemetery, Manila Memorial Cemetery. Now, on one hand, this location is great, right? Because slum dwellers here can work in BF Homes as tricycle drivers, as domestic workers, that kind of thing. And they can work here as caretakers of the burial plots and mausoleums within the cemetery, right? So in terms of finding work, this location is opportune, right? And it makes sense that a slum would emerge at this spot. Now, on the other hand, this is a bad location, and I'll tell you why. These slum dwellers find themselves locked in on both sides. For instance, this is a part of BF Homes called Tierra Maria, and it shares a gate with this part of Delarama slum called Target 1. Now, this gate here used to be where the folks who live in this panhandle portion of Delarama, they used to enter and exit through this gate, and they used to have their water and housing materials delivered through it. Now, Tierra Maria, fearing that the squatters, essentially on the other side of the gate, literally, were criminals, closed off the gate unilaterally. So now the folks here can no longer get their, let me get the arrow so I can show you. They can no longer get their water and housing materials delivered through here. On the other side, the cemetery also closed their gate to Delarama slum. Now, they have to allow them in sometime because they work in the cemetery. So they allow them in only between 5 and 10:15 a.m. And that's mainly in order to dispatch their caretaking duties before the visitors to the cemetery arrive, right? So essentially what I'm saying is that these folks here are really locked in on both sides, right? So one informant complained, they banned us from BF and closed off Memorial. How are we supposed to get out? It's like we're imprisoned here. Okay, let me talk about my second case. Oh, by the way, this is the cemetery. This is one of the smaller mausoleums in the cemetery, and here you have a slum dweller from Delarama doing some improvements on this mausoleum. What's interesting to me is that there's an air conditioning unit, and this is a mausoleum. So there's a dead guy in there, and he is AC, and this is the wall separating the cemetery from the slum on the other side. You'll note that there's a path here which suggests that this wall didn't always used to be there. Okay, let's talk about another case. So this is Don Antonio. Don Antonio is in Quezon City. Now, gating effectively split Don Antonio into two parts. This used to be one unified village, but during the 90s, out of fears of squatters and crime, they gated this road. By the way, it's Holy Spirit Drive. It used to be the access road into the one unified village, but because of gating, it's become a kind of Berlin Wall separating the north from the south. Now, Don Antonio North is completely secured, in the words of the villagers. That means, in the words of one informant, it has one entrance, one exit, and no squatters. Don Antonio South, on the other hand, is, quote, breached. Hundreds of squatters occupy vacant lots within this area here, Don Antonio South. In fact, half of this street, let me get my arrow, half of this street, Don Vicente Street, the blue lines, by the way, are where I did my fieldwork among the urban, talking to folks in the slum areas. Don Vicente Street in Don Antonio South, half this street, about this much, is essentially indistinguishable from the slum area outside it, and the other half are these high-walled houses. But you don't have to take my word for it. I can show this to you because I took a video driving from one end of Don Vicente to another, and I won't show you the whole video because it's a little too long. But I'll show you a bit of it right before the contrast happens. Okay, so I'm on a street within a village that's surrounded by walls, right? So this is within it, right? If the camera is bumpy, that's because this part of Don Vicente is unpaved. Okay, so around here the contrast starts to happening. You see those signs that say it's forbidden to hang out in front of these houses. You're going to see that the camera gets more steady because the road is paved, and the housing quality increases remarkably, and you just see these walls rise up and get higher and higher. All right, you get the point. So I'm going to stop that. Okay. Okay, so you have this, you really have this contiguity of slums and enclaves even within the same village. The Village Association of Don Antonio South, this part here, has taken several steps in the name of security. They've gated breaches along the perimeter. They've restricted gate access. They've imposed a curfew, 10 p.m., on their own residents, but that includes everybody within the village. And they've also tried to wall out this part of the street here, Don Vicente. They've tried to do that about 4 or 5 times, but every time they do that, the squatters who live in this area destroy the wall, and they're within their legal right to do so because this is a public road and private citizens can't barricade it. Now, because of this mix, villagers have come to adopt more intensive forms of enclosure. They buy up the empty lots adjacent to their properties and they gate them. They make a ritual of patrolling their respective sides. One villager even partitioned her own house into an upstairs and downstairs. She put a gate separating the upstairs and downstairs, and when she sleeps at night, she only sleeps downstairs, expecting that if robbers come, they're going to come in through the upstairs, but then they'll be trapped in the upstairs area, right? Now, this siege mentality affects the squatters living within and just outside Don Antonio in really consequential ways. Let me illustrate this for you. So look at this map here. So I talked to a woman, her name was Eileen, and she lives here on Samonte Street, right around here. Now, she works as a washerwoman in a house here within Don Antonio South. Now, there used to be a gate here. There actually still is a gate here. And so conceivably, she could walk from, where's my arrow? She could walk from Samonte Street to the house here. But because they've closed this gate unilaterally, and again, it's not even, they really don't have the legal right to do so, but they've closed this gate. So what Eileen has to do is, to get to this house here, she has to walk down Samonte Street all the way, walk down Commonwealth Ave, down Holy Spirit Drive, enter the formal gate, right? Now, she's stopped at the formal gate, she's detained, and the guard calls her employer, who lives here, and says, Eileen's here, she's here to wash your clothes, can we let her in? And the employer will say yes. So Eileen enters the village, walks, where's my arrow? She walks here to get here. Now keep in mind, she lives here. Okay. Sometimes boundaries are enforced in more dramatic ways as well. Another informant, Charito, recounted that a 7-year-old boy who had clambered up a guava tree to pick the fruit had been mistaken for a thief by one villager and shot in the back. It seems the villager had assumed that the boy was using the tree to scale his property. In a different case, another purported thief had been shot and killed, but what Charito found the most offensive was the fact that the perpetrator took the trouble to dump the body in the slum outside the village, right? Presumably where he thought it belonged. Okay. So my second claim is that boundary imposition, which I've just illustrated, has heightened the urban poor's consciousness of territorial stigma, which again is stigma based on residence, right? I'm going to turn to this now. Now, riding the metro rail, as it passed above San Roque, this is a slum, Elena overheard another passenger describe the slum, her home, as an eyesore. So this is the view of San Roque from the MRT or the metro rail, right? I'm riding the train and I took this picture. This is where Elena lives, and she heard a passenger on the train say, "Oh, that place is an eyesore." Although ashamed and indignant, Elena felt powerless to rebuke the passenger, given how thoroughly squatting is stigmatized. "It really hurts," she said, "to hear that you live in a slum, that you act like a squatter, a hoodlum, a killer, someone who snatches away people's bags and holds them up in the street." Now, I have a lot of data along these lines, but I won't belabor the point. Suffice to say, slum dwellers expect to be discriminated against. And by the way, as you can see, that this is supported by my count data. But I do want to make one point about territorial stigma that will matter in my later analysis, and it's this. Territorial stigma is largely embodied. Now, it's embodied in two ways. First, by embodied, I mean that it's experienced primarily through feelings or introspective states. So feelings, pain or shame, introspective states, I'm talking about mental dispositions such as a sense of inferiority, right? Okay, so for example, I talked to Nellie, and Nellie recounted her son first becoming aware of the fact that he was a squatter and her mother was a squatter. "My son asked me, 'Mama, are we squatters?' His classmates said we are. I said we were, but we're not anymore. That depressed me." So out of shame, Nellie parried the label squatter by essentially equivocating to her son. She referred him to their formal condition as technically no longer squatters, since they'd recently acquired the land through a government-subsidized program. But she knows full well that her son's classmate is referring to their territorial status, something that hasn't changed despite the change in their legal status. The second point about territorial stigma being embodied is that it's experienced as a bodily condition, like a disease, right? And it's associated with various taboos to prevent contamination. For example, I talked to Myrna, and Myrna said, "You do this to the rich," and she swiped my arm with her finger. And they'll say, "Yuck." Here's another example. Evelyn recounted an incident at a party for the lay workers of Santa Rita Church. Now, the party included both the residents of San Roque, which is the slum, and the residents of the village, Philam. And here's her story. "You can't brush against another person." "Why not?" "They rub themselves with alcohol." "In front of you?" "Yes." "You're saying that someone rubbed themselves with alcohol in front of you?" "Yes." Now, as we'll see, the urban poor's embodiment of territorial stigma in this sense, as something communicated by their bodies, makes physical contact a particularly important indicator of sincerity. And I'm going to turn to sincerity right now. My final claim is that the urban poor's heightened consciousness of stigma led them to support Estrada because of his concrete acts of sincerity. All right. So most of my informants supported Estrada, overwhelmingly because they think he's good for the poor. Now, this data in itself is not surprising. It's a finding that's actually borne out by a number of surveys. By the way, despite this perception that Estrada is good for the poor, there's actually very little evidence to show that he provided the poor with much material help. Only 12 informants personally benefited or knew someone who benefited from Estrada's patronage. There's even less evidence that the urban poor supported Estrada because of his screen persona as defender of the oppressed. Only 9 informants mentioned it as one reason for supporting him. So my data clearly supports the view, and the general survey data generally supports the view that the poor believed Estrada's pro-poor persona, right? They believed that he was good for the poor. The question really is why? What about Estrada's persona were the poor responding to? His flouting of middle and upper class Moors, his characteristically informal and even vulgar behavior, his indulgence in vices supposedly common among the poor. Why? Why are they responding to this guy? So I pursued the question further. And as I did, my informants shifted their emphasis from Estrada being good for the poor to Estrada being a good person, someone who really cared about the poor. He was commonly described as kind, compassionate, humble, approachable, and unaffected. He doesn't act superior, Anita said. He treats everyone equally. More than just prioritizing the poor as a matter of policy, informants described Estrada as actively recognizing them. The Filipino expression, marunong tumingin, literally he knows how to look at us, in contrast to the rich who look down on the poor or pretend not to see them, recurred repeatedly during interviews. But again, why did informants see him in this light? Now at this point, my informant's explicit knowledge in the form of the reported responses was not sufficient to answer the question, and so I turned to their stories describing Estrada's interaction with the poor. Now, my informant's stories were distinguished by a common theme: the absence or negation of stigma in Estrada's conduct towards them. Now, this quality, what I'm calling sincerity, is evident less in what Estrada does for them than in how he treats them. For example, Erlinda described approaching Estrada for help. What stood out for her was not just the fact that he gave it, but that in doing so, quote, he didn't embarrass us. We saw that he helped the poor a lot and that he would help you if you really needed it. At the time, my husband was sick, and we went to Erap's house in Green Hills. I brought with me a handful of prescriptions. Thank God he didn't embarrass us. He gave us medicine and even money to commute home. You can't just approach other politicians like that because you feel uneasy, but with him you can speak freely and openly because he sees you as an equal. Now, the poor's discernment of sincerity, of Estrada's sincerity, is predicated on an awareness of the general insincerity of other politicians. Nearly half my informants explicitly distinguished Estrada from other politicians. Other politicians just use us, Banks said, but Estrada's different. He really cares about us. Contrary to popular portrayals of the poor as easily duped, the notion of sincerity suggests that the poor are particularly savvy in distinguishing politicians who merely seek to use them from politicians truly acting on their behalf. Populist tactics from acts of sincerity. The stories of my informants suggest that this distinction is informed primarily by a politician's conduct towards the poor. So sincerity here, I'm claiming, is a quality revealed by a manner of being at ease among squatters, of treating them essentially as if the stigma reinforced by their everyday class interactions doesn't exist. And to some extent, it defies simulation. So it's hard to pretend that you're sincere, right? This is something that politicians periodically discover. Now, Gloria Arroyo, who you remember succeeded Estrada, visited the San Roque slum more times than Estrada did, right? She even built a schoolhouse there. And yet residents describe her as, quote, plastic. And they tell stories of her uneasiness during visits. Quote, Arap came here without a bodyguard, Renata recalled, but Arroyo came with a whole battalion, and she was still scared to get on stage. When it burned here, Benjalin recounted, Gloria came to visit, but no one paid her any mind. So, noting Arroyo's strenuous wooing of the poor, the writer June Cruz Reyes quipped, Gloria's put on a denim jacket. She's wearing a t-shirt and eating with her hands in front of the media. If she doesn't stop trying to be like Joseph Estrada, the day after tomorrow, she'll grow a mustache. Now, I had the chance to witness Joseph Estrada's sincerity myself. As I pointed out in the methods section, I was in the Philippines at the time that he was running for president. And I had the chance to accompany his entourage, rather, on a campaign sortie. The sortie was through the provinces just south of Manila. Here, I want to recount an incident recorded in my field notes. I'm going to read my field notes of my experience at the time accompanying Estrada on this campaign sortie. Estrada spent the day giving speeches and greeting thousands of supporters from a trolley in procession through several small cities. At the end of the day, we stopped for dinner at a fancy Chinese restaurant. After dinner, Estrada walked out of the restaurant to find that a man, by appearance a street vendor, had been waiting outside to greet him. The man was thin and wearing a white tank top and shorts. Slung around his neck, he carried a tray filled with candy, chewing gum, and cigarettes by the piece. When he saw Estrada, he started chanting, barely audibly, Erap, 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 only to interrupt himself and exclaim, also quietly, Idol, The man was clearly nervous about meeting Estrada. Without hesitation, Estrada walked up to him, took his hand in greeting, and thanked him for his support. He then gestured to an aide who went inside the campaign bus to retrieve paraphernalia, an Arab t-shirt and cap, which Estrada handed to the man before boarding the bus. What struck me was that he did all this without a hint of artifice. He didn't pretend that he wasn't tired, a 73-year-old man who had spent the last 14 hours campaigning, or act differently than he acted while dining among his friends. He probably did nothing that his presidential rivals, in similar circumstances, would not also do. What distinguished him was how naturally he carried himself. So the significance of this quality, for me, came into focus much later as I went through my data. And I found that Linda, another of my informants, that her description of Estrada's appeal spoke directly to what I'd recorded in my field notes. She took his familiarity for acceptance. This is Linda. Arab will accept you however dirty you are. Other politicians may shake your hand, but afterwards, they'll wash theirs with alcohol. Now, I can show you Estrada's sincerity in action through pictures again. Here's Estrada at a slum, and he's buying ice cream for everybody around him. Essentially, he's buying the vendor out. Estrada here, again in a slum, and he has a tradition of spreading banana leaves on a table and, filling it with food and then just going at it with his hands and inviting everybody around him to go at the food with his hands. It's called a boodle. Note the reaction of this woman here. I love that reaction. Again, this is Estrada in the same boodle. Now, Estrada clearly loved the poor. He conveyed it through innumerable gestures, and here's one of them. And the poor returned this affection. So, again, what I think we're seeing here, this touching, feeding, hugging, kissing, visiting slums without the symbolic wall of bodyguards, is Estrada bridging the social distance between himself and the poor, essentially by closing the physical distance between them, right? Squatters remember these actions so vividly because they negate the sense of stigma that class interactions normally reinforce. So what's the effect of all this? What's the effect of this bond between Estrada and the urban poor? I think that stories depicting acts of sincerity corroborate Estrada's populist persona as conveyed by his rhetoric and public behavior. In a political landscape where appeals to the poor are electorally imperative and thus common, such stories distinguish Estrada as sincere and worthy of support. Now this bond here that the urban poor formed with Estrada was palpable during interviews. His mugshot, this picture here, I showed informants his mugshot, right? It triggered an outpouring of emotion among my informants. 68, there it is. 68 expressed feelings of pity, sadness, bitterness, and pain upon seeing this picture. Some informants reached out to take the photograph. Some asked if they could keep it. Some got angry. They decried the way Estrada was publicly shamed in this photograph. A handful wept. One woman broke out into goosebumps and insisted that I feel the ridges on her arms. And another woman remembered that at the time this photograph was taken, Estrada had been down with a cold. And here's the picture of the woman who broke out into goosebumps. And she was surprised by the violence of her reaction to this picture, and she insisted that I take the picture. Okay. All right, I'm going to conclude quickly because I want to hear your reactions. But simply to recap, I've made 3 claims. And I hope I've demonstrated them for you. One, that interspersion has led to the rampant imposition of boundaries on the urban poor. Second, that this boundary imposition has heightened the urban poor's consciousness of territorial stigma. And third, that their heightened consciousness of stigma has led them to support Estrada, not because of his patronage, not because of his screen persona, and not just because of his anti-elite posturing, but because of concrete acts of sincerity negating stigma. Now, essentially, what I'm trying to do here is to connect a spatial configuration, interspersion, essentially a kind of segregation, with certain political outcomes, right? Specifically, the poor support of populism. And I'm going to stop there, so thank you.
Okay, let's throw it out for questions. Marco, go ahead and field your own questions. We have a mic, sorry, just for the recording. So.
You're discussing Manila, of course, which is his neighborhood, But you indicate that support in other slums, other places is not quite as strong.
Outside the metropolis, that's right.
Outside the Manila area and other urban areas of the Philippines. So you would see that as less interspersion in the other areas, as less sort of stigma then?
Well, the pattern, it's not necessarily, Estrada, his support can be strong in other areas. For instance, in 2010, he carried most of Christian Mindanao, right? But my point is, I don't think Sincerity is the reason for that. I think it's probably because of his prosecution of this all-out war against the MILF during his time there are different political logics that can take place that can explain Estrada's support outside Metro Manila. But if you look at Metro Manila itself, the pattern that I'm most interested in is the fact that support for Estrada remained higher than the poor elsewhere, higher than the urban poor elsewhere, and it doesn't seem to be explained by things like greater patronage, or this kind of susceptibility to a screen persona. And so that's why I think this reason makes more sense, right? And it's, of course, supported by my data. So yeah, it's not the only reason people support Estrada. There are other reasons that have a lineage in the literature, like political alliances, clientelism, regionalism, these kinds of things. But in Metro Manila, because of this spatial configuration, which is really particular to this one metropolis, it's less so in other cities like Cebu, et cetera. I think there's really a connection there, and I would even go so far as to say that in other cities where you see this kind of interspersion, places like Sao Paulo, Mumbai, across this domain of developing world cities, I think you see the same kind of greater class consciousness, the articulation of class in terms of territory, leading to surprising political outcomes. Yeah.
So what you're saying is where you have the interspersion
Yeah.
is your central word, where the slums are in effect penetrating the city as opposed to merely being around the outside is what makes it a major difference.
In a phrase, it's really contiguity. It's really proximity is the main mechanism here, right? That's a really important question, and just to kind of underscore the fact that I think for why interspersion matters, let's look at, hold on here. So this is poverty incidence during this period, right? Now, poverty incidence declined substantially, right? So the literature would say that, well, relative deprivation, greater poverty, greater immiseration, greater income inequality might have led to greater stigma. But you actually see poverty declining sharply during this period. Income inequality remained largely the same. Now compare these two graphs with spatial inequality. Now spatial inequality increased precipitously during this same period. So it's my claim that this is where we should be looking, not where scholars traditionally point to. Relative, it's not just inequality, right? It's not just we're talking about spatial inequality. Yeah. Deirdre.
Thanks for a really great talk. So I was with you most of the way, and I find the contemporary history you provide of interspersion and the density and the embodiment of stigma and then the negation of stigma through the proximity of Arap and his even touching them, I find that all very persuasive. My question is around your use of sincerity.
Yeah.
On the one hand, and this is sort of a more cynical take, on the one hand, one could resurrect the fact that Estrada is a really good actor, and so that there's actually a very performative dimension to this physical proximity that he's enacting in all of in his presence in the slums. On the other hand, I'm curious as to why you don't draw from more vernacular notions that are clearly at work in the interviews that you do. I mean, around pity, around compassion, and why you don't choose to draw from those vernacular terms and then translate them, or are you translating something like awa or damai into sincerity, and that's where you're using it?
Yeah, those are two very good questions, and let me talk about them individually. So first, this was about Estrada's experience as an actor, right? And there's clearly
the most banal. I mean,
no,
it's
not
important. Necessarily one that I'm convinced by.
No, it's important, and I want to address it.
Yeah.
There clearly, clearly, sincerity calls attention to the performative aspect of politics, right? I mean, for sure, right? To bodily comportment, to behavior, these kind of things that might impress people more than what he says,
Right.
especially in a context given to political dissimulation, where trust in politicians is low, right? Now, I think I think that if you think about Estrada's acting, right, I actually think that has less importance in informing his show of sincerity. First of all, there's a question of, is Estrada actually sincere? Now, I think that question is kind of problematic,
Yeah,
right?
I know,
Because,
it's not
you know,
the
it
best
suggests that
question.
you're either sincere or you're not,
Right.
Which does, you know, I don't know if that really stands up analytically. But the better question is, why does Estrada give an impression of being sincere, right? Now, most people would say, well, he was an actor, right? So this comes off. I happen to think that it has less to do with his acting experience than with his long career as a local politician. Now, as a local politician, he had to interact with the poor and really had to develop an effective way of relating to them, you know, face to face. And I think this became second nature to him. You know, that really became a practical disposition, if you like, that when he runs for higher offices really comes across. I think that's more significant than him just being an actor, because if we're simply talking about celebrity, you know, you could look at a number of celebrities who fail, who are even greater celebrities, like Manny Pacquiao, for instance.
Right.
I mean, he's congressman now, but the first time he ran in his own district, he lost. Right?
Yeah.
So that's the first point, and the second one has to do with these other things, like, right, you know, this Rey Leto, you know, the passion, the pasión, awa, you know, it's incredibly rich, you know, and to some degree it's supported by my evidence. You talk about you know, people comparing Estrada to Jesus Christ, right?
Right.
You know, clearly there's cultural resonance going on, right? Some kind of resonance with deeper religious themes. But I think now, you know, I think all that's very important, but I think sincerity is prior to that it works, that it sets the stage for these kind of assumptions, right? It's this perception that we can trust this guy, that this guy is for real, right? That makes these other associations possible. So I don't see them as different explanations. I see them as actually predicated one on the other. But I think if you look at both of them, I think you need this kind of recognition of yourself being recognized at the first, as the prior moment before.
Before you can have
That's
pity,
right.
or before you can have
Yeah, but thank you for the questions. Those are good ones.
Did you want to ask a question?
Hi, also, thank you also for a great talk. I got a couple questions I'll try to get out quickly. One is, so there's Estrada, the one man, but I was wondering, you know, since he became the president and he runs in elections and everything, how his own strategies of this very personal sincerity might translate into the rest of his party, or the rest of the kind of organizing forces that he uses. And then secondly is, since I'm not very familiar with the situation in the Philippines, if you mentioned the idea of people cleansing themselves with alcohol after, you know, interacting with these slum dwellers, and I was wondering if there are other kind of linguistic or ethnic or other kind of divisions that, or even manneristically, that would divide people who live in villages versus people who live in these neighboring, you know, communities.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Two very good questions. The first, if I understand that correctly, that's about to what extent can this sincerity be used as a political tactic, right? Can it be generalized, used by other politicians, right? In some ways, it's no secret, right, that if you can appeal to the poor on the base, if you can behave in ways that really endear yourself to the poor, that's, in terms of popular support, you know, your spades, right? So it's not, so it's certainly a political tactic in the context of the Philippines. Now the thing is, it's actually very hard to simulate effectively, and so that it fails most of the time. I've given you a couple of examples here of people who deploy a populist narrative, deploy populist tactics, who may even go into slums, as in the case of Arroyo, and try to do what you're supposed to do to give the impression of being sincere, right? You know, touch people, hug them, go into slums. And yet, it doesn't always take, right? Like I said, the poor, you know, the poor are actually very, very savvy in being able to distinguish who's sincere and who's not, right? So it's not always clear whether sincerity, just because it's deployed as a political tactic, will be successful. So, you know, like if you're familiar with Weber's concept of charisma, it's highly individualistic, right? But that's not to say that it's not widely used, right? You know, and it's also independent of Estrada, which is an important point. So I would go into some slums, and people would be able to tell me which local politicians had visited. They'd be able to tell me when they visited, and they'd be able to tell me specifically whether they visited with bodyguards or not, or unescorted. You know, so this is something people clearly note, and it's not just Estrada, right? But whether people can actually pull it off or not is the bigger question. And so the other question is about other cleavages that may account for this distinction instead of just the territorial basis, right? Slums are actually pretty diverse areas, right? They're diverse in terms of income. As I said, only about 20% are actually poor based on government statistics. So there's class diversity. There's diversity in terms of region, where people come from in the country. And of course, other kinds of diversity. In terms of ethnicity, you know, really in the Philippines, what matters is region, you know, where you come from, so provincial background, that kind of thing. And slums, while there tend to be concentrations of people from one province versus another, there tend to be more of a mix in slums in general. And the fact is, in villages, you have the same kind of provincial diversity. So, you know what? So I was going to say that. So I really think it's territorial status, because that's the most important cleavage. But except maybe for religion, if you're talking about a slum that's primarily Muslim, that might be a basis of discrimination in Manila, anyway. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Marco and welcome.
Thank you.